For a century, the blood oath of Aldenford remained unbroken. The Alpha demanded a mate of iron and cunning, setting a trial that left high-born females scarred and broken. They said no woman could survive the pack leader's challenge. Then, a silent Omega stepped into the fighting pit. History remembers the winter of 1342 as the year of the bleeding frost, a time when the snows of the northern reaches turned crimson. But hidden within the private, sealed journals of Lord Alaric Pendleton, a minor noble who recorded the secret history of the continent's shapeshifters, lies the true reason for the bloodshed. It was the year of the Gauntlet of Moons. Castle Aldenford stood as a brutal monument to the Blackwood Pack's dominance. Built into the jagged cliffs of the Iron Peak Mountains, its stone halls echoed with the snarls and politics of werewolf nobility. At the head of this vicious hierarchy sat Alpha Kaelin Blackwood. At 28, Kaelin was a terrifying force of nature, a war-hardened leader whose reign was threatened by a single, archaic law. An Alpha of the Blackwood line could not hold the high seat past his 30th winter without a bonded Luna who had proven her worth through the gauntlet. It was a brutal trial of survival, designed to weed out the weak and ensure only the strongest bloodlines continued. For 3 months, the courtyard of Aldenford had been a theatre of agony. Daughters of powerful alphas, fierce, battle-trained warriors draped in furs and entitlement, had travelled from across the continent to claim the title. Lady Beatrice of the Riverlands had her leg shattered in the first trial. The formidable Duchess Clara of the Northern Steppes was dragged out of the pit, weeping and stripped of her wolf spirit. Then came Lady Rowena Castlemaire. Rowena was a stunning, ruthless, beta-born female whose family controlled the wealthy eastern trade routes. According to Pendleton's diaries, Rowena was so confident she arrived with her coronation gown already tailored. The first phase of the gauntlet was seemingly simple but functionally suicidal. The contender had to enter the Harrowing Woods, a sealed-off, ancient section of the forest where the pack locked away their feral-shifted ancestors, known as the Stalkers. The task was to retrieve the nightshade orchid, a rare flower that bloomed only in the deepest, darkest den of these beasts, and return before dawn. Rowena entered with a broadsword and the arrogant roar of a predator. Within 2 hours, the great wooden gates of the woods violently shook. The guards pulled the heavy iron levers to open them, and Rowena collapsed over the threshold. Her armor was shredded, her silver-white fur matted with her own blood, and her left arm was mangled beyond repair. She had not even reached the den. From the high balcony, Kaelin Blackwood looked down at the bleeding noblewoman with eyes as cold as the winter stones. He did not sneer, nor did he offer pity. He simply turned away. The message was clear. Failure. Below the balcony, kneeling in the shadows of the courtyard with a heavy scrub brush in her calloused hands, was Maeve Harriston. To the high-born wolves of Aldenford, Maeve was practically invisible. She was an Omega, the lowest rung of the pack hierarchy, tasked with cleaning the hearths, scraping blood from the fighting pits, and keeping her eyes firmly on the cobblestones. She was a refugee from the decimated Oakhaven pack, brought in as a servant years ago. But Maeve possessed something the pampered nobility lacked, an acute, quiet observation, born of survival. For weeks, Maeve had watched the challengers fail. She had cleaned their blood. She had listened to their boasts before the trials and their screams during them. But more importantly, she had listened to the woods. While the high-born wolves relied on brute strength to fight the stalkers, Maeve, who often gathered firewood near the boundary gates, noticed the patterns. The feral beasts were blind. They hunted purely by scent and sound. They were highly aggressive toward the pheromones of dominance, alphas and aggressive betas like Rowena. That evening, the great hall of Aldenford was filled with a tense, suffocating silence. The fire roared, casting long, dancing shadows over the faces of the pack elders. Silas Vane, Kaelin's cunning and deeply ambitious beta, stood near the throne, whispering poison into the Alpha's ear. "The bloodline is cursed, Kaelin," Silas murmured, his voice loud enough for the nearby nobles to hear. "Perhaps the old laws must be rewritten. If no woman can pass the challenge, I will gladly step up as proxy Alpha until a suitable arrangement can be made with the southern packs." It was a blatant power play. Silas wanted the throne. Kaelin gripped the carved armrests of his oak chair, his knuckles turning white. He knew the politics at play. If he failed to find a mate, the council would force him to step down, and Silas would plunge the pack into civil war. "The gauntlet remains." Kaelin's voice rumbled, a deep, chest-vibrating sound that commanded absolute silence in the hall. "Is there no other female of age who dares to claim the right?" The hall was dead silent. The aristocratic women looked away, terrified. From the back of the room, near the servants' corridors, a soft clatter echoed. A wooden wash bucket was set carefully onto the stone floor. A small figure stepped out of the shadows. "I claim the right." A ripple of shock, followed instantly by harsh, barking laughter, tore through the great hall. Nobles pointed and jeered. Silas Vane threw his head back and laughed aloud, the sound dripping with cruel amusement. "A scullery maid?" Silas mocked, stepping forward. "An Omega whose wolf is so weak she cannot even shift fully without trembling? Go back to your rags, girl, before the Alpha has you whipped for interrupting the council." Maeve did not flinch. She kept her head leveled, her brown eyes locking directly onto Kaelin Blackwood. In werewolf society, for an Omega to meet an Alpha's gaze was a challenge bordering on a death sentence. Yet, she stared at him, unblinking. "The law states any female of age, unmated, may enter the gauntlet," Maeve said, her voice quiet, but possessing a strange, ringing clarity that cut through the murmurs. "It mentions no rank, it mentions no bloodline. Are the Blackwoods now breaking their own sacred laws?" Kaelin leaned forward, the shadows of the fire playing across his scarred jawline. His golden eyes narrowed, assessing her. She was small, dressed in coarse, grey wool, her hands rough from labour. There was no scent of aggression on her, no boastful arrogance. There was only a cold, hard stillness that he had only ever seen in seasoned veterans on the eve of a massacre. "She is correct," Kaelin said softly, silencing the hall instantly. Silas looked at Kaelin in disbelief. "Alpha, you cannot be serious," Silas hissed. "She will be torn apart in 5 minutes. It's an insult to the tradition." "The tradition," Kaelin replied, rising to his towering height, "is meant to find a mate who possesses what our pack needs to survive. So far, the Highborn have brought nothing but arrogance and failure. Let the Omega try." He stepped down from the dais, stopping mere inches from Maeve. He was twice her size, radiating a dominating aura that would have forced any normal Omega to their knees. Maeve held her ground, though her breathing hitched slightly. "You will enter the Harrowing Woods at midnight," Kaelin told her, his voice a low, intimate rumble meant only for her. "If you scream, I will not open the gates." "I won't," she whispered back. At midnight, the air outside Castle Aldenford was freezing, biting at exposed skin like needles of ice. The entire pack had gathered atop the stone walls to watch the spectacle, many placing wagers on how many minutes the Omega would survive. Maeve stood before the iron gates of the Harrowing Woods. Unlike the others, she wore no armor. She carried no sword. Dressed in fitted leather and a thick wool cloak, she carried only a small, leather satchel slung across her chest. Silas Vane, who was in charge of the gate mechanism, sneered down at her. "Say your prayers to the Moon Mother, little rat." He pulled the heavy lever. The gates groaned open, revealing the pitch-black maw of the ancient forest. A low, guttural snarl echoed from the dark trees. Maeve stepped inside, and the gates slammed shut behind her with a dreadful finality. As soon as she was cloaked in the darkness of the pines, Maeve did something no other challenger had done. She did not shift into her wolf form. Shifting created noise, and it amplified the scent of adrenaline and dominance. Instead, she knelt in the snow and opened her satchel. From Lord Pendleton's historical notes, we know that Maeve Harriston was not just an Omega. Her mother had been a pack healer before the Oakhaven massacre. Maeve had spent her childhood learning the deep magic of the earth. She pulled out a handful of crushed bloodroot, dried valerian, and ash from the castle hearths. She rubbed the foul-smelling mixture vigorously over her clothes, her skin, and her hair. The ash masked her human scent, while the bloodroot and valerian mimicked the scent of the rotting flora and damp earth of the forest. To the blind, feral stalkers, she would smell like nothing more than a passing breeze over dead leaves. Moving with painstaking slowness, Maeve ventured deeper. The woods were a nightmare landscape of twisted roots and frozen briars. Within an hour, she encountered her first stalker. It dropped from a branch above, a massive, emaciated wolf beast with milky, blind eyes and jaws dripping with dark saliva. It landed 10 feet away, its head snapping side to side, sniffing the air frantically. Maeve froze. She slowed her heartbeat, a discipline she had mastered to survive the volatile temperaments of the Aldenford nobility. The beast padded closer, its wet nose hovering mere inches from her face. The stench of rotting meat was overpowering. Maeve didn't blink. She breathed shallowly through her nose. After an agonizing minute, the stalker lost interest, turning and loping away into the shadows. She pressed on, using the stars visible through the canopy to navigate toward the central ravine, the known location of the stalker dens. By the third hour, she reached the edge of a deep, rocky chasm. At the bottom, glowing with a faint, bioluminescent blue light, was a cluster of nightshade orchids, but the floor of the chasm was littered with the sleeping forms of dozens of stalkers. Using a coil of thin, silent rope she had smuggled in, Maeve rappelled down the sheer rock face. Every pebble that shifted beneath her boots threatened to wake the horde. She reached the bottom, her boots touching the soft, mossy earth. Stepping over the massive, heaving bodies of the sleeping beasts, she reached the orchids. With a steady hand, she sliced the stem of the largest flower, placed it carefully in her pouch, and began the ascent. She had succeeded where the greatest warriors had failed. All she had to do was return to the gate. But as she reached the top of the ravine and began her trek back, a sudden, sharp scent cut through the cold air. It wasn't the scent of a feral beast, it was the scent of a werewolf, and it was fresh. She quickened her pace, reaching the iron gates just as the first sliver of dawn began to paint the horizon grey. She grasped the heavy iron bars and looked through. The courtyard was empty. The guards were gone. Maeve reached for the emergency pull chain designed to signal her return. It was missing. It had been cleanly severed from the other side. Panic flared in her chest. She looked closely at the locking mechanism. Someone had jammed a thick iron wedge into the gears from the outside. She was locked in. A twig snapped behind her. Maeve spun around. Standing in the tree line, shifting from his human form into a massive, heavily scarred brown wolf, was one of Silas Vane's loyal enforcers, a brute named Garrick. Silas had not been content to simply let the woods kill her. He had sent an assassin to ensure she never walked out with the prize, plotting to blame her death on the stalkers. Garrick lunged, his jaws snapping toward her throat. Maeve dodged, but she was small, and a glancing blow from his shoulder sent her flying into the iron gates, her head striking the metal with a sickening crack. Her vision blurred. The massive wolf stalked toward her, a low growl vibrating in his throat, ready for the killing bite. Maeve backed against the iron bars, her hands grasping wildly in the snow. Her fingers brushed against something hard. a loose, heavy cobblestone that had broken off from the castle wall's foundation. As Garrick leaped for her throat, Maeve didn't scream. She ducked under his massive weight, driving the jagged edge of the heavy stone upward with every ounce of desperate, terrified strength she possessed, aiming precisely for the soft vulnerability beneath his jaw. The impact reverberated up Maeve's arm, jarring her bones. The jagged edge of the heavy foundation stone caught the massive brown wolf perfectly in the soft, unprotected flesh beneath his jaw. The force of his own lunge drove the makeshift weapon deep into his trachea. Garrick's roar of triumph turned into a wet, suffocating gurgle. His colossal momentum carried them both into the snow, but his jaws snapped shut on empty air. Maeve scrambled backward, her breath coming in ragged, white plumes in the freezing air. Garrick thrashed in the crimson-stained snow, reverting halfway to his human form as his body went into shock, before finally going agonizingly still. Silence slammed back down over the harrowing woods. Maeve did not have the luxury of shock. She forced herself up, her left side screaming in pain from where he had battered her against the iron gates. She knelt beside the dead enforcer. She recognized him instantly. Garrick was a brute, but more importantly, he was the shadow of Silas Vane. Reaching into the heavy folds of Garrick's cloak, her fingers brushed against cold metal. She yanked it free. It was a heavy, silver cloak clasp, intricately forged in the shape of a coiled serpent, the undeniable family crest of House Vane. Silas had been so arrogant, so certain of her demise in the jaws of the stalkers, that he hadn't even bothered to strip his assassin of identifying markers. She pocketed the clasp. The sky was turning a bruised purple, the preamble to dawn. The gauntlet required her to return to the great hall before the sun broke the horizon. The main gates were securely jammed, but Maeve knew Castle Aldenford better than the lords who ruled it. According to Lord Alaric Pendleton's meticulously preserved architectural sketches, the fortress possessed a drainage grate that emptied the castle's excess spring water into the ravines of the woods. It was a narrow, rusted iron culvert built half a century prior, designed only for runoff, not for a person. But Maeve was small, and she was desperate. She ran along the perimeter wall until she found the outflow grate, hidden beneath a thick curtain of frozen ivy. The iron bars were rusted thin. Using the same blooded cobblestone, she battered the weakened metal until one of the bars snapped, creating a gap just wide enough for her shoulders. Maeve plunged into the freezing, waist-deep water of the tunnel. The cold was a physical assault, a million needles driving into her flesh, threatening to stop her heart. The tunnel was pitch black, filled with the stench of stagnant mud and old iron. She dragged herself upward through the darkness, her muscles tearing, her mind focusing solely on the rhythm of her own heartbeat. Do not stop. Do not die in the dark. Above ground, the great hall of Aldenford was bathed in the warm, flickering light of 100 torches. The high-born wolves were gathered, sipping hot mulled wine, a stark contrast to the deathly cold outside. The heavy curtains had been drawn back to reveal the eastern windows, where the first pale rays of the morning sun were piercing the winter sky. The sun had risen. Silas Vane stood near the center of the hall, a carefully practiced look of solemnity on his sharp features. He turned to Alpha Kaelan Blackwood, who sat motionless on his carved oak throne, his golden eyes fixed unblinkingly on the heavy wooden doors of the hall. "The sun has breached the horizon, Alpha," Silas announced, his voice carrying effortlessly over the murmuring crowd. "The gates remain closed. The emergency chain was not pulled. The Omega has fallen to the stalkers, just as the high-born ladies before her." A few nobles nodded in agreement. Lord Branwell, a wealthy landowner from the Western Ridges, stepped forward. "It is a tragedy, to be sure, but it proves what we have said all along. The blood right is too much. The Blackwood line must seek alternatives. Silas has offered a temporary proxy leadership to stabilize the pack's trade routes, while we negotiate a traditional marriage with the Southern Territories." Kaelin's grip on the armrests was so tight, the ancient wood began to splinter. He felt a hollow, burning rage in his chest. He had seen something in the Omega's eyes, a terrifying, unyielding iron, and he had gambled his pack's future on it. And now, she was gone. "The pack needs leadership, Kaelin," Silas pressed, stepping closer to the dais, a dangerous glint in his eye. "Step down. Let us handle this with dignity, before the council forces a vote of no confidence." Kaelin stood slowly, his massive frame casting a long, terrifying shadow over Silas. "The council does not dictate the Alpha. Blood dictates the Alpha. And your bloodline ends today," Silas hissed back, dropping the facade of respect. Before Kaelin could unleash the beast within him and tear Silas's throat out in front of the entire court, a heavy, resounding thud echoed through the chamber. Everyone froze. The great oak doors of the hall groaned. The heavy iron latch was thrown back, and the doors pushed open. The gasps from the aristocratic crowd sucked the air from the room. Women covered their mouths. Hardened warriors took a step back in sheer disbelief. Standing in the doorway was Maeve Harriston. She looked like a spectre dragged from the depths of hell. She was soaked to the bone, her clothes clinging to her shivering frame, dripping freezing mud and black water onto the polished stone floor. Her face was pale, smeared with dirt, ash, and Garrick's blood. Her lip was split, and a dark bruise was blooming across her left temple. Yet she stood entirely upright. The hall was dead silent, save for the steady drip, drip, drip of water falling from her cloak. She walked forward. The crowd of nobles instinctively parted for her, clearing a wide path to the throne. She didn't look at them. She didn't look at Silas Vane, whose face had drained of all color, his eyes bulging in terror. She looked only at Kaelin. Maeve reached the base of the dais. With a trembling, raw hand, she reached into her saturated leather satchel. She pulled out a pristine, glowing blue flower. The nightshade orchid. She tossed it onto the stone floor at Kaelin's feet. A collective breath hitched in the room. She had done it. The scullery maid had conquered the gauntlet of moons. "The rite is fulfilled," Maeve said, her voice raspy, but echoing with absolute authority. Kaelin stared at the glowing flower, then up at her bruised, defiant face. A slow, primal rumble of sheer awe vibrated in his chest. But before he could speak, Silas Vane panicked. "She cheated!" Silas roared, pointing a trembling finger at her. "She's an Omega! She could never have bypassed the stalkers. She must have hidden by the gates and waited for the dawn." Maeve finally turned her head, fixing Silas with a stare so cold it could have frozen the blood in his veins. "I did not hide by the gates, Silas Vane," Maeve said quietly. "Because the gates were jammed from the outside. The emergency chain was cut, and a wolf was waiting in the tree line to ensure I did not return." Outrage erupted among the elders. Sabotaging the sacred blood rite was the highest form of treason in werewolf law. "Lies!" Silas bellowed, his face flushing red. "The delirium of a freezing, wretched servant. Where is your proof, rat?" Maeve reached into her pocket. She withdrew her fist and threw something hard across the floor. It skittered over the polished stones, chiming like a death knell, and stopped directly against Silas's boot. It was the heavy, blood-stained silver clasp of the Vane serpent. "I pulled that from the corpse of your enforcer, Garrick, after I crushed his throat with a cobblestone," Maeve stated, her voice slicing through the noise of the hall. "Check the outer locking gears of the Harrowing Woods. You will find his iron wedge still there." Silas stared down at his family crest, his jaw trembling. He looked up, locking eyes with Kaelin. The Alpha did not ask for a vote. He did not consult the elders. In a blur of motion, too fast for the human eye to track, Kaelin lunged down the steps of the dais. He didn't shift. He didn't need to. He grabbed Silas Vane by the throat, hoisting the traitor off the ground with one hand. "You dishonored the right. You endangered my mate. You sought to break the pack," Cailan snarled, his eyes bleeding into a luminous, terrifying gold. With a sickening crack that echoed into the high-vaulted ceilings, Cailan snapped the Beta's neck and dropped his lifeless body onto the stone floor. The Alpha turned back to the room. The nobles dropped to their knees, bowing their heads in absolute submission, terrified of the violence and awed by the undeniable truth before them. Cailan walked over to Maeve. He ignored the mud, the blood, and the freezing water. He knelt on one knee before the quiet Omega, picking up the nightshade orchid. "The challenge is met," Cailan declared, his voice a vow that shook the very foundations of Castle Aldenford. "Behold your Luna." The transition of power following the year of the Bleeding Frost was meticulously documented in Lord Alaric Pendleton's private journals. To the highborn wolves, an Omega sitting upon the high seat, swathed in midnight furs with the heavy silver rings of the Luna upon her scarred fingers, was a blasphemy. They believed her low birth meant she was uneducated, easily manipulated, and wholly unfit for the throne. They were devastatingly wrong. The first true test of her reign came swiftly. Lord Branwell and Lady Evangeline, furious at the disruption of their ancient hierarchy, conspired with a neighbouring territory to assassinate Cailan during a border patrol, plotting to frame the surviving feral stalkers. They assumed Maeve, the former scullery maid who used to sweep their floors, was completely oblivious to their whispers. Instead, on the eve of their coup, Maeve summoned them to her private solar. The nobles entered with arrogant sneers, only to find their intercepted, treasonous letters pinned to Maeve's heavy oak desk with a hunting dagger. Beside the parchment sat a glass vial of refined, highly toxic wolfsbane. "You have two choices," Maeve spoke softly, her brown eyes possessing a cold, deadly stillness. "You will drink this vial right now and spare your families the absolute shame of a public execution. Or I will show these letters to my mate, and he will tear your bloodlines from the earth. Choose." Terrified by the sheer, unblinking ruthlessness of the quiet Omega, they dropped to their knees and confessed, fleeing the territory into permanent exile before dawn. There was no further rebellion. The nobility quickly realized that while Cailan was the terrifying, physical muscle of Aldenford, Maeve was its lethal, omniscient mind. But Maeve's most legendary contribution, the twist that elevated her from a cunning survivor to a historical savior, was unraveling the pack's darkest secret. The curse of the Blackwoods, the terrifying madness that created the feral stalkers, had plagued the territory for centuries. Remembering her mother's teachings as a pack apothecary, Maeve barricaded herself in the deepest vaults with Lord Pendleton to study the archives. She found a terrifying anomaly in their history. The madness only ever afflicted the highest-ranking nobles and fierce warlords. The Omegas and servants never succumbed. "It isn't a magical curse," Maeve revealed to the stunned council days later, dropping an antique blackened chalice onto the stone war table. "It is poison. Generations ago, the Blackwoods had forged their grandest drinking vessels from a newly discovered western vein of dark silver, a metal heavily laced with raw lead. When the highly acidic spiced wines of the north were served at noble feasts, the heavy metal leached into their drinks, reacting violently with their shifter physiology and permanently degenerating their minds. The terrifying stalkers in the woods were not cursed beasts. They were the slowly poisoned ancestors of the very nobles sitting in the hall. Maeve ordered the immediate melting of all tainted silver and redesigned the castle's entire water filtration system. Within a few short years, the madness completely vanished. She had cured the incurable. The Gauntlet of Moons was abolished forever. When visiting lords questioned why the sacred blood rite was gone, Alpha Cailan would simply look across the great hall at Maeve and smile. The gauntlet demanded a woman who could conquer the monsters in the dark, Kaelin would say. I found her, and she killed the monsters, so no one else would ever have to. Thank you for diving into the treacherous and romantic world of Castle Aldenford. If Maeve's incredible journey from a quiet, underestimated Omega to the most cunning and legendary Luna in history kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Don't forget to share this story with your fellow fantasy romance lovers and subscribe to our channel for more epic, mythical tales.